I'm lucky. We're now seeing around the country, there are, I think, less fortunate academics who are being fired or suspended for their speech. And because there's now so many of them, they're not as high profile. I kind of was the canary in the coal mine, and I benefited from that. I can't say enough how grateful I am. I have a lot of support around the country, emotional and financial, and I'm very, very lucky. This system we have is tremendously favors the rich. It's not equal justice for all. It's equal justice for the rich because they can continue to just fund and fund and fund litigation. It's so unrealistic to think that this isn't causing severe emotional distress to rip a tenure professor out of the classroom.
For
This was
example.
clearly punitive.
Right.
And as punitive, it is a deprivation of due process. It's not equal justice for all. It's equal justice for the rich.
That's not the system that I think we all think that we live in, but it is. And it's really just because in the United States, we have this American rule, is what they call it around the world, that the winners of litigation pay their attorney's fees. It is really unequal justice. And it's unfortunate that now it's making its way into the academic realm. Professor Levy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. So you study a fascinating combination of subjects in your role as a law professor. Can you give us a little bit of your background, just kind of what your intellectual interests are and what you study and teach about now?
Sure. Yeah. In the 90s, I went to grad school at Rutgers, and I eventually earned my PhD in philosophy. My dissertation was on free will. And the title of the dissertation was Free Will Hunting, which was a play on a movie that had recently come out, Good Will Hunting. And then I went to law school, practiced for 4 years, and had enough. I had my fill and got back into academia, did a fellowship at Harvard Law School. And then I got a job at LSU, and I started teaching there in 2009. And my main courses were criminal law courses. So criminal law, advanced criminal law, white collar criminal law, and international criminal law. But I also, for the first 3 years, taught torts. In 2025, I was suspended and eventually got a visiting offer from Cleveland State University College of Law, where I am now visiting. And I'm teaching torts, have to give the final. And then next semester, I'm teaching 2 sections of criminal law and criminal procedure. But most of my academic work, I mean, it's all over the place in philosophy and in law. I would say most of the legal stuff is in criminal theory, but I've also done some constitutional law or constitutional theory as well. And then in philosophy, it's just a random mix of paradoxes, free will and responsibility. I did a little history of philosophy earlier on, but I would say my main interest at the core of all of this since the 90s has been metaphysics, the mind-body problem, free will, and responsibility, and that kind of has fueled. I'm also fascinated by evil, and I think that's what got me into criminal law. I'm not saying any criminals are evil, but that it just got me into that.
Sure.
So
Sure. Yeah. The problem of evil, right? I guess they call that theodicy. Is that right? I mean,
that's one of many
of the
problems
problems
in
of
the
evil.
area of evil. I guess I'm Jewish, and from a very early age, I was traumatized and fascinated by the Nazis,
Mhm.
and so I think that was a contributing factor.
Sure. Sure. So I don't want to bury the lead. You mentioned that you were suspended in 2025. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, on January 14th, 2025, that was my very first class ever in criminal procedure. I had been preparing many months for this course, and I was a little nervous. I hadn't taught a new course in many years. Um, at so I just went. I had prepared, my kind of notes, and as a experienced professor, you sort of riff. When I was going through the syllabus, I referenced the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry's, basically attack on a colleague of mine two months earlier. This colleague had said to his class on Zoom, basically after Trump was elected for the second time, to the Trump supporters, be nice and respectful to your fellow students who are not Trump supporters. And the governor got a hold of this video and blasted him on Twitter. And so when I was going through my syllabus, I told my students, you may not record, no less distribute a recording of this class. In riffing on this, I said the words, F the governor. See, I wouldn't want that to get out. I wouldn't want that to be distributed. Well, ironically, that's exactly what was recorded and distributed, because I didn't know it, but many students have this program called Glean, and Glean provides like kind of a rough transcript and audio. And so that got out there. And then later in the class, I was talking about the case book and the class overall. And I basically just said, Trump, I'm very worried about the incoming administration. At that point, it was 6 days away. And I'm worried that they preferred autocracy to democracy. And I don't know that many of our constitutional rights may be obliterated. Much of what we're reading might not be, might be destroyed. But I said, but we have to, I'm going to teach this as good law. It is good law right now. But in the course of talking about Trump, I used, again, the F word.
Mm-hmm.
And so it turned out that an anonymous student, who is still to this day has not been identified, he went to some powerful person. Nobody knows the exact chain of communication, but it got to the governor. It got to all the powerful people at LSU. And 4 days later, I got a letter saying that I've been suspended indefinitely, pending an investigation into my quote unquote inappropriate remarks in class. And so that suspension is ongoing to this day. It's almost 11 months, 10 and a half months. And I sued LSU, I think 2 weeks later, for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction, which I won both. But the First Circuit Court of Appeal immediately stayed and then reversed both of those, and then reversed the preliminary injunction. And that preliminary injunction litigation has been ongoing to this day. And the First Circuit basically recently granted LSU's appeal. And then when we filed for a motion for reconsideration, they denied it. So now my only avenue left in the preliminary injunction litigation is to go to the Supreme Court, Louisiana Supreme Court. So that's where everything is.
So there's a lot there that I want to unpack. The most recent opinion I read from the First Circuit, because I think they made an interesting distinction between your property rights and or didn't mention your free speech rights. For people that are non-lawyers and they're not versed in procedure, you have not had a trial. Yeah, you're not appealing a final outcome. You're appealing a preliminary injunction hearing to just be able to get your job back pending a trial in the merits. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
And so you have a GoFundMe going right now, which I'm going to publish in the description of this video, and also in my LinkedIn posts where I post elsewhere. How much money have you spent just on this up to this stage now, trying to just get your job back pending a trial? Where is the cost for you?
So I've had 2 lawyers, and now I have one, and the total cost is around $70,000+. Now, fortunately, my GoFundMe raised around 60. I made another plea just yesterday. I haven't been monitoring it, but I'm hoping some more can come in. But yeah, it's probably, so thank God for that 60,000, because I just don't have that. And I wouldn't have been able to, and I don't think I would have moved as far as I have if it had been all up to me. So I'm very grateful to everybody who's contributed to that. So yeah, it's called Leave Levy Alone. If anybody wants to contribute, I can use all the contributions, because I'm behind in my legal bills right now, as well as my other bills. But and my lawyer, Bruce Hamilton, has been very patient. But I do have to pay him at some point. And I took a pay cut, and I'm visiting Cleveland State University right now. And LSU, basically the former interim president, Matt Lee, when I asked him if I could have special leave with pay, he said, you can have special leave without pay. So LSU isn't paying me this year, and I'm merely a visiting professor at CSU. So money has been an issue, but there's a principle at stake here, and my job is at stake, my career is at stake, and so I do have to fight this. I think to the very top. I think to the Louisiana Supreme Court, and I just hope that they do the right thing. You had mentioned that the First Circuit denied or granted LSU's appeal on the grounds of due process.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't even touch free speech. So when we made a motion to reconsider, we said, you neglected the free speech issue, please address it. And they said denied.
One
We're
word.
hoping, when we appeal to the Louisiana Supreme Court, that they'll address it.
So, when I read that opinion, and without really looking at a lot of context before, I just was reading the opinion alone. You've got a professor who voices something that is unpopular and has now been suspended. You're asking to have your job reinstated. They didn't even mention free speech. I think there was one throwaway line in the opinion that I read, the one that was recently. But what they were talking about was that you have a property interest in tenure. Can you explain to us first of all, what tenure is and why they would consider that a property interest, what the constitutional relevance of that is in terms of due process?
Yeah, and we're getting into legal territory that I've only had to learn through my case. I mean, I'm a crim guy and a torts guy, so this is all. So tenure is basically something you professor, academics have to earn, and generally it's granted by their faculty, and then it goes up the chain all the way to usually to the president of the university. And the idea is to give you protection, job security, so that you don't have to worry about getting fired for saying the wrong thing. Most employment in the United States is at will employment. They can just fire you without cause. The law firms are, a good example, unless you make partner, and then it's probably different. But as an associate, they can just fire you at will. You can't do that with tenure. You can't just fire somebody at will. And that's so I earned tenure in 2015, and it was something that was quite meaningful to me. People had said, "Oh, you'll take it for granted." I never took it for granted in the 10 years I had it, because when I was at the law firms, it was brutal. And they asked people, left and right. So I learned through my case in the early 1900s, and it was clear it was designed to protect academic freedom, primarily against public officials, politicians who were coming down on various professors, not liking what they said, trying to censor them. And so the institution of tenure spread, and it was the idea, we want to give our professors maximal freedom. We may not like everything they're saying, the universities, but we want them to have the freedom to say it. Technically, untenured people have this academic freedom too, but we all know how it works. What if a university, either the faculty, the provost, or the president doesn't like something that a faculty member is saying, or they're getting pressure from a public official, and that person is untenured, they're going to find a way to just say, "Oh, it's not about your speech, it's about your teaching, or it's about your service, or about your scholarship." With a tenured professor, you can't do that. You have to say, "No, it was about your speech," because all those other reasons aren't reasons for firing somebody. Well, now that they have tenure, so it's a now one thing that's going on in the United States is that there are various politicians, mostly Republican, in fact, I think all, who are trying to get rid of tenure. And it's transparent what they're trying to do. They don't want professors having job security, because when professors don't have job security, they don't speak out. And when they don't speak out, people, public officials are safe from criticism. So this is all about, this is also about due process. We can get into that. So the idea that tenure is a property right, generally when you don't have tenure, you don't have a property right in your job. They can just take it away from you. That's at will employment. Tenure gives me a property right. It gives me that you can't just take it away from me. It's like it's anything you own. I own that. In a sense, I own that job. Now, there is property. They can take your property away from you if you're not paying taxes on it, if you haven't fully paid for it. So there are reasons why they can take your tenure job away from you. But it's a high bar. And so in that sense, it's a property interest, as opposed to, like I said, the at will employment, where they can just take that away from you willy-nilly.
Right, right. Well, and the due process comes from the Fifth and 14th Amendments, and they say you can't deprive you of your life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which means there's some sort of process and fairness, procedural fairness that you're supposed to be afforded. But you have tenure, or you've had it, and yet you're not working, or you're not for LSU, they're not paying you. So, it seems like in this case that protection was not afforded, at least in this case, where it seems to be designed to do that. Right. This seems to be the kind of a textbook example of why. You also published a paper last year, year before last, about free speech on campus. And for all we know, this could be a retaliation for that. That's exactly the kind of speech that we want professors to be engaging in. And in an academic journal, there's nothing. Tenure is in theory what protects you from being retaliated on that basis. And when I read that in the First Circuit's opinion, that they were saying, well, your tenure hasn't been revoked, so you haven't had your property interest deprived. My question was, well, but if they're not paying you, what good is it to have the tenure?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, I was put on paid leave, so I was being paid throughout the spring of 2025. What happened is when I received the offer to teach at CSU, Cleveland State University, I asked the interim president if I could still be, move to Cleveland, teach there for a year, and still be paid by LSU. And then Matt Lee, the interim president, said, "Well, no, I mean, because the standard arrangement is you're either paid by one institution or the other." That's not quite true. My understanding is that when tenured professors go and visit other institutions, the two institutions work it out so that they're not taking a pay cut, because then who would go visit?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
and so there was I think, a bit of disingenuousness there. But that's what he said. I wasn't going to argue because I don't think I could have won that argument.
Mhm.
So so technically, I'm not. I'm still on paid leave, but
Okay.
because I'm visiting CSU, I'm not being paid by LSU. And that was one of their big arguments at the preliminary injunction hearing, is that, well, he still has his job and he's still being paid, haven't deprived him of any property. The thing is, it's so unrealistic to think that this isn't causing severe emotional distress to rip a tenured professor out of the classroom. I think that is a property deprivation. And the idea was, well, we have to do an investigation. You could do that investigation full well without taking me out of the classroom. And it wasn't like they thought, well, he's a threat to the students, because they even said in my letter, they said, you're still welcome on campus. So
Okay.
so
So you could
so
have
I'm
kept your
so
office, for
this was
example.
clearly punitive.
Right.
And as punitive, it is a deprivation of due process. Now, the First Circuit said otherwise, but I just think they're wrong. I mean, I have a property interest in my job, and that job includes teaching, primarily teaching. That's my vocation. So it's totally farcical. It's just ridiculous to say that there was no deprivation there. It was a full deprivation of my teaching privileges, and that is the core of my job. But this is Louisiana so far. I mean, let's hope this Louisiana Supreme Court goes, sees it straight, sees it the other way. But it's not the case in many other states, where they say, no, you can't suspend anybody, no less a tenured professor, without notice in a hearing. And I got neither. I mean, and that's a total deprivation.
Right. So the other thing, though, too, is that, to like what you're saying, to cast tenure as a merely economic interest misses, I think, the whole purpose of having tenure. I mean, there is something, we have in the United States, federal judges have life tenure, right? Like, they can't be fired except for bad behavior, and that's so that they'll act independently. And to take someone's salary away or reduce their salary is a way of punishing them. But we're not really necessarily, I mean, what we're wanting to protect there is their opinions. We want their opinions to be independent. And to say that tenure only protects your job, your paycheck, misses, I think, the broader point with why we need it, which is to protect academic freedom. And that was when I read the opinion. I was like, there's something glaringly missing here, which is that the point of you being able to have the job is that it does afford you the right to speak in a certain context. So hopefully that the Supreme Court will see it that way. Can you tell me, this might be a little inside ball and procedure, but can you tell me, why did you have to file in state court, since it's against an institution of the state of Louisiana, and not in federal court, for example?
Yeah. So my initial attorney basically said that if we went straight to federal court, which was, there was some inclination to do that, because we just thought it might be more favorable than the state courts. They would toss the others, LSU would object on 11th Amendment grounds, and most likely, based on my first attorney's experience, it would be tossed. That whole process would have taken a few weeks, and time was of the essence. So, because I had just been suspended 2 weeks earlier, and I wanted to get back into the classroom. So we filed in state court. We got really two very good judges for the temporary restraining order. Judge Don Johnson granted it. First Circuit immediately stayed it. Then we had the preliminary injunction hearing in mid-February. Judge Tarbold Smith granted it. First Circuit immediately stayed it, and a week later reversed it. But I would have been back in the classroom were it not for the First Circuit, and that was all through state court. There was, I've had conversations with my attorneys about moving it into federal court, but the general consensus was, let's keep it in state court, and I can always bring a federal case later, and that would be a damages case. This is all
Right.
injunctive relief right now.
Right. And injunctive relief, again, so this, I was thinking about this earlier about how people pay for attorneys in this country. And I think people see they'll see billboards. There's always, even I live in Nashville, there's billboards for personal injury attorney. And the business model of plaintiffs' lawyers is they're getting paid out of a damages award of money, and they'll take a percentage of that. But a lot of injustices are not remedied with a check, right? In this case, you're not asking them to pay you a bunch of money to make you rich. You're asking for you to be restored to your job. So it's not like you can pay an attorney out of a piece of that. You can't give them a piece of your salary or something. People are expected to generally pay upfront, to be able to get their attorneys to vindicate that. If you win, let's say you get a final and unappealable judgment from the Louisiana Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court for that matter, you'll still have to pay your attorneys out of your pocket, right? There's no scenario where LSU is going to pay your attorneys, or are there?
I don't know. You know better how it works. I'm assuming as of now that I'm going to be on the hook for at least the state litigation that's ongoing now. If I bring a damages claim, I would hope to get attorneys on contingency for that, and that's common because it's basically a civil rights case, and civil rights attorneys often work on contingency. I don't think I would bring that case if I had to pay for it because I just don't have it.
Right, right. Well, so this is kind of the issue with our justice system, and it obviously involves. I do want to also get to your scholarship on just the criminal justice system, because this kind of affects that. I mean, that we like to think that everybody has equal justice, but it really makes a big difference if you're wealthy enough to pay attorneys, and that is not just in the criminal domain, where I think it's a particular issue in the country. It affects free speech cases because we have these things called anti-SLAPP laws. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but like strategic lawsuits against public participation, where if you say something about a billionaire that he doesn't like, he'll sue you, and just harass you with bankrupting litigation. And there are laws to prevent that, but they're at a state by state basis, and they, you can just forum shop. So it's actually a really effective strategy if you are a person who's very wealthy or you have a large budget at your disposal, such as like the state of Louisiana or Louisiana State University, that no individual who's responsible for this action against you is going to personally pay large sums of money to finance this litigation. And so it's kind of punishment by process, is it not? I mean, it's essentially de facto, it's silencing you through financial pressure.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm lucky, like I said, that my case is pretty high profile. And because of that, I was able to get 60,000 in donations to my GoFundMe, without which I could not have continued this litigation. I'm lucky. We're now seeing around the country, there are, I think, less fortunate academics who are being fired or suspended for their speech. And because there's now so many of them, they're not as high profile. I kind of was the canary in the coal mine, and I benefited from that. And I can't say enough how grateful I am to all the, I have a lot of support around the country, emotional and financial, and I'm very, very lucky. Basically this system we have is tremendously favors the rich. It's not equal justice for all. It's equal justice for the rich, because they can continue to just fund and fund and fund litigation and like you said, bury people who don't have that kind of money. There are people who go pro se, but I mean, I've been through law school. I've been a lawyer, and I teach law, and I wouldn't have known how to do. I mean, I've learned, and I do contract attorney work, but you need lawyers who know this stuff to really, for the TRO and the preliminary injunction and what arguments you need to make. And that all takes expertise, and most people don't have that, including lawyers. So you have to have the money. And if you don't have the money, you can't fight. And if you can't fight, they win. And this is our system. And they take advantage of it. Like you said, they just keep filing the motions that they have the money to fund, and eventually they win.
Right.
It's just not fair. It's not fair.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also stunning. I mean, people hear things like attorney's fees or legal costs, and they're like, okay, it's expensive, but expensive could mean different things to different people. Like, that's a relative term, really. But when I hear that you spent over $70,000 just arguing about a preliminary motion, which it's an important substance of the remedy that you're looking for. You would get this preliminary injunction, and then hopefully you would go to trial, and then there would be a permanent injunction later. but like, the reason we have this preliminary injunction is to prevent further harm. It's to prevent irreparable damage resulting. And you've spent now $70,000 to get something that's supposed to be preliminary, and you still have a trial that would have to take place, presumably, right? There's a trial that would have to take place at some point. And so, it's staggering that those numbers could get that high this fast. But also, I mean, I know attorneys, I know how they bill, I know what they cost per hour. And so it makes sense that that's what it would be. But no ordinary American could pay that. I mean, I think the average ordinary American could not come up with $1,000 within 24 hours. So like in an emergency, if their child needs some kind of operation, which is something that they also would need to pay for. And so it really is like the only real safety is anonymity. Is to be quiet. It's just to not say anything that's going to be offensive or unpopular to people who are in control of the government or in this time, or who are very, very wealthy. And that's not the system that I think we all think that we live in, but it is. And it's really just because in the United States, we have this American rule, is what they call it around the world, that the winners of litigation pay their attorney's fees. It's the British rule, the losers pay for both parties. And it's this policy choice that we've made. But now, like, if you successfully defend yourself in frivolous litigation, you still have to pay your own attorney's fees. And it seems like just a way to protect people that are vastly wealthier. When there's a vast wealth disparity between the parties, it is really unequal justice. And it's unfortunate that now it's making its way into the academic realm.
Yeah, the financial, really, there's been two great stresses in my life over the last 10 and a half months, and that's career and financial. And I was making a decent living as a professor, and I now realize how fortunate I was. And it's been quite hard, so it's anybody who's been through, who is in litigation, and I've heard, a lot of people have come and told me their own stories. There are plenty of people in Louisiana alone, a lot of them in family court, and they've had to spend over $100,000 to battle their spouse. And often it's a very lopsided, one spouse has much more money than the other spouse. And there's children involved in custody. And it just seems like you're throwing money into a black hole. And the courts are my general sense is that they favor one side over the other. There seems to be some bias. I won't get into that, but I certainly haven't been happy with the First Circuit's decisions on my behalf. But in any event, the money litigation is so expensive. I do constantly wonder if there's a better way. One thing I've been thinking for academia is, and I've been talking with some others, is that academics tend to be very independent, and yet some faculties have unionized, but not enough. LSU certainly, and I think there's some efforts, but if they can unionize, even at a university, certainly across universities, my idea is to generate a fund like Union News. And then when any professor gets in trouble, and legitimate trouble, there are professors who, do horrible things. They sext their students.
Right.
I'm not talking about real transgressions like violence or sexual harassment or anything. I'm just talking about straightforward speech here. As in my case, there should be a fund. I'm not saying it would fully fund anybody who's litigating. Maybe it could be means tested. The richer professors can shoulder more of their burden. But somebody like me could have really used that fund. Now, again, I got lucky with the GoFundMe, but I'm on the hook for probably 10 or 15, at least more than that I can't afford, at least now. It would have been nice to have a fund to, support that. So that's an idea that I'm floating. But that would only be for academia. There's plenty of people who are not in academia. In fact, most are not. And what do they do when they're faced with litigation? It's just a very unfortunate reality of our entire system.
Yeah, I mean, it particularly in matters of free speech. I mean, I looked into this with a short film that I want to produce, and you have to get licensing of certain things. And my film is very much of a satirical nature, and it particularly satirizes the Coca-Cola Corporation. And it makes use of a mural, and it involves someone selling coke and selling cocaine. And I'm making a very, in my opinion, very obvious political satire about capitalism and drug policy and how Coca-Cola used to sell cocaine. And now they're the most beloved, they're synonymous with American capitalism. And, I talked briefly with an attorney, and they were just like, you need to get their permission. I'm like, of course I don't need their permission. I'm satirizing them. No one would ever agree with it. That's why it's fair use. It's, you know, it's First Amendment activity. But her point was like, you would spend at least $100,000 just to get to a definitive ruling on that in its summary judgment. Even if you won, like they'll bankrupt you. And so no one's going to want to distribute the film. And I realized because like, again, if you win a First Amendment case, it still could bankrupt you. And that's just a glaring hole in our free speech system that we have here in the United States, where we are among the freest countries in the world, if not the freest in terms of what you're allowed to say. I mean, things in the UK have gotten, to me, seems very restrictive. People are going to jail for social media posts. And that's not the reality here in the United States because of the First Amendment, but because of how expensive things are, it's just like the litigation in particular. We really only have First Amendment for large institutions primarily now, like newspapers, for example. But even that's becoming decentralized. So I want to ask also about how I really want to get into free will. It's just something that I've been dying to talk about, but it affects crime and punishment a lot. And I remember your class was one of my favorites of my first year of law school because we talked a lot about we talked a lot about questions that begun with the word why, which to me are what I call the ultimate questions. You could call them questions of philosophy. But there was this question that was one of the most confounding ones I ever considered in law school, which was, why do we punish people at all? And there are multiple different theories of that. Can you kind of just walk us through, like in the United States, we have this criminal justice system. How does crime and punishment and the philosophy of why we punish affect or inform the discussion of criminal justice reform in the United States?
Great question. Yeah. Well, there are three, and I'm sure you remember, there are three basic theories of criminal punishment, theories to justify criminal punishment. Because think about what criminal punishment is. It's a total deprivation of liberty and often property. It is basically the state taking you and putting you, we're talking about prison, obviously. There are also criminal fines, but that would be a total deprivation of property. But they're taking you and putting you in prison. They're depriving you of your liberty. And so there should be a very high bar before the state can do that to anybody, especially in a democracy, in a free country, a democracy. So what justifies even doing that? And there are three theories. There's retributivism, consequentialism, and expressivism. Retributivism says that's what they deserve. They were convicted of a serious crime. They deserve to go to jail for a certain number of years. There's consequentialism. This will bring about great consequences. General deterrence, it will deter other people from committing that crime. A specific deterrence, if from when that person's let out of jail, they'll be deterred from committing that crime. Rehabilitation, victim closure. There's all sorts of good consequences. There's some costs. We have to feed the prisoners and pay for the jail. So economic costs. They're not in the labor force. They're not paying taxes. So there's those costs. There's a lot of economic, but there's also non-economic costs like suffering, breaking apart families. But the idea is behind the imprisonment, the benefits outweigh the costs, right? So, and then the expressivism is kind of a newcomer, but it's been around for decades, which is the idea that punishment is a language, and this is how we can communicate the society's condemnation, and the extent to which we imprison somebody is the extent to which we condemn it. And mere words couldn't do justice, right? Just shaking your finger at somebody and saying shame on you doesn't quite do justice to what they did. You have to actually use another language, and that's punishment. I don't think any particular theory happen to lean toward retributivism, but I've written a paper saying that retributivism and consequentialism work together. Retributivism needs consequentialism. I also think expressivism is a perfectly valid and respectable theory as well. That's all justifying punishment. But the criminal justice reform movement is saying, okay, we get it. We're not, there's a few prison abolitionists. They say you get rid of the prisons. The problem with that position, and they have to address this and they know it, is then what do you do with the truly dangerous people? And so there's been various proposals. Generally, they say quarantine. That's what been, we just don't, it would be in effect the same thing, but we don't have the same language or the same punitiveness. It's much more about rehabilitation and restorative justice than retributive justice. But the criminal justice reform movement is obviously responding to mass incarceration, where we have locked up far too many people, and it's been quite racist in the proportions, which we imprison Black people and Latinos, millions of people in jail. We have more people in jail per capita than most other countries. And so think about, not only is that terribly immoral, and such an injustice to a lot of those people who are locked up and their families, but then there's also the huge economic costs as well. So it's just a terrible system. It's terrible what we've done. And the movie 13th, which I used to show to my advanced crim class every year, really just spells this out. Just spells it out, historically what is going on here. And so we can have justifications of punishment, and philosophy is great. I love philosophy, as you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
but criminal justice reform is very much enough with the philosophy. There are people's lives at stake. Many people have gone to jail. Many have gone to jail who didn't do the crime, and this is coming out with DNA evidence all the time. So we have a system that's not at all infallible, and it's putting way too many people in prison and destroying lives. And so the criminal justice reform movement is really just trying to say enough with that. Let's try to make it a criminal justice system, not a criminal injustice system.
Right. Well said. So I want to mention the documentary you mentioned is The 13th. That's Ava DuVernay. That's in reference to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, but there's a loophole, which is except for punish of a crime, forced servitude. That's some of the best cinematography of any documentary I've seen. Also, it's a tremendously well made film, and I'm an aspiring filmmaker myself, so I definitely know that film well. You said, I'm interested to know your opinion on, is there a difference between the stated aims of criminal punishment in the United States versus what you think the actual effect of criminal punishment is?
Yes and no. I mean, the stated aims, um, again, retributism, giving criminals what they deserve. I think if you believe in free will and responsibility, and therefore desert, then you believe that some, if not many people, deserve punishment, right? Whether it's a
Mhm.
fine or rapists, murderers. We can talk about all the violent crimes. There might be more of a debate about some white collar crimes, but they deserve it. And the pure retributive line is, it doesn't matter what the consequences of punishing are. If they deserve it, that's enough of a justification. They don't care. The pure retributivists don't care about consequences. The consequentialists are all about consequences. They don't care. Pure consequentialists don't really care about desert. They just like, what's the optimal punishment for this one, for that one, for this one, for that one, so we can get the optimal benefit cost ratio. Right. And it's much more economic in that sense. And there's a little bit of sleight of hand going on there, because you can never precisely quantify, certainly the non-economic costs.
Right.
But look, I mean, I do think there is deterrence. We were talking before about free speech. I mean, when public officials reach into universities and punish people like me, get me suspended or fired, that has a tremendous deterrent. It's called the chilling effect on
Mhm.
many other faculty. I am sure that most, if not all, faculty at LSU are quite well behaved this year. They're not swearing, and they are not saying anything political. And that's a shame. Now, the swearing, fine. I do know other colleagues who say they swear all the time in class. Not alone. If anybody thinks I was the only
No,
one
yeah,
using those words.
and it was my experience while I was there that f bombs were just not unheard of in a law school class. There is a First Amendment case, I think called Cohen versus California, where a guy was arrested for wearing a jacket that said "fuck the draft," and it's really hard to discuss anything about that case if you're not, if you're too sensitive to foul language. So, a law school classroom it's a different kind of space. It's, I think, one of the freest spaces on any college campus anywhere in America, because it has to be, because it's you have to be able to talk about the arguments for both sides, where that seems like of late, in a lot of universities in the United States, that those conversations are just not quite as free as they were maybe even 15 years ago. But I've been under the impression, maybe wrongly, that the law school was kind of the last bastion of that, maybe philosophy graduate departments. And do you think that that's I guess, what do you think about that in terms of what we've been seeing of late with, the issues in academia? Because the Republicans are definitely reacting to what they see as a chilling of speech from the left in academia. Whether they're right or wrong about that, or whether their reaction is proportional, we could discuss. It seems like the legal academia has remained mostly untouched by that. What do you think about all of that?
Not anymore, thanks in part to my case. But we're seeing academics, both in law schools and outside law schools, being punished for saying nasty things about Charlie Kirk after he was assassinated. And I'm just told by people, mostly in red states and mostly in the deep South, and that's where most of the suspensions and firings are coming from, that they're quite afraid and they are on their best behavior. If I were still teaching at LSU, you can only imagine I'd be on my best behavior. Teaching at CSU, I was on my best behavior before, but now I won't. Okay, I don't swear anymore. I mean, but I still, what I won't do is I will still engage in normative commentary, meaning I'm going to tell students, I don't think this is right. I do think that's right. And I'm not ever going to stop doing that. And I've been told, oh, you shouldn't, administrators don't like to hear that. Well, quite frankly, in a law school, you can't avoid that. You can't teach Plessy v. Ferguson and just say, look, that's what the court thought. And then it was Brown v. Board. There has to be law school. It has to be critical commentary. Law is all about, you have to be able to criticize the law and criticize the decisions. I mean, I'm not saying it's all subjective. You have to give arguments, but you have to give the arguments. You can't just be neutral about everything because that sends the wrong message. And that's saying they're all equal. Everything's equal. It's all relative. It's just this court thought this, that court thought that. You need to get the students to be thinking critically about this. And not only in terms of precedent and legislative history and all that, but and original intent, or in terms of justice. We have to talk about justice, and justice is contested, and there's different notions of justice and competing notions. You had said that the right was upset with the left about chilling their speech. And in a sense, I am a casualty of, it's our turn now. We don't like what you did to us. Now we're doing it to you. Well, first of all, two wrongs don't make a right. But secondly, what was the chilling effect? My understanding is generally people on the right in academia were punished in some way. I mean, whether it was socially or by the university for saying horrendous things. That was usually quite offensive in the sense of racist, sexist. I mean, they were, so in the article that you referenced earlier, I published this in October 2024 in the William and Mary Bill of Rights Journal, and it was quite prescient because 3 months later, this happened to me. The title of the article is "The First Amendment in Education. May faculty at public universities be disciplined for political hate speech?" And the conundrum or the puzzle that I was trying to solve is, on the one hand, if we had a tenured professor getting up and espousing white supremacy in their political science class, let's say, I think I called that person Alan, that would be intolerable. But yet, how do we explain that? How do we reconcile that with a broad First Amendment and broad academic freedom? Certainly, and we certainly wouldn't punish a character I named Claudia for espousing egalitarianism, right? Saying everybody's equal and we should treat each other respectfully. But those are two different viewpoints, opposite viewpoints. Why can we punish one but not the other was the conundrum. And my answer to that was, well, generally, you can't punish any viewpoint. That's viewpoint discrimination. The state can't. Yeah, and we're talking about state universities,
Right.
Private universities can do what they want. But public universities are bound by the First Amendment, and usually the state constitution has something like the First Amendment in it. They can't punish speech, but there are limits. And so, for example, fighting words, you can punish fighting words. If a professor was challenging his students to a duel, or a fight,
Right.
that doesn't have to be allowed. And defamation. And there's other limits on free speech. Here was a tough one, though, because this is hate speech. Hate speech is not, there's not a clear, first of all, it's not clear exactly what is hate speech and what isn't, but also there's really it's not a category that's been prohibited by the Supreme Court. In fact, just the opposite. There have been hate speech statutes that they've shot down. So the question was, how do you punish fairly the white supremacist professor, but not the egalitarian professor? And my answer was, generally, you can't punish either unless they're engaging in dehumanizing speech, because the students and the university also have rights. While we professors have broad First Amendment rights, the students also have broad rights. They have a right to, I think, what I call a fair, welcoming, and inclusive learning environment. And dehumanizing speech violates that right. So I limited it to, the speech that can be punished to dehumanizing speech. And then people were saying, well, I'm such a hypocrite. Here I was engaging in political hate speech and saying I shouldn't have been punished. No, my speech was criticism of public officials. Hate speech is directed, usually it's directed against individuals because they're members of a certain group, or a certain race, national origin, their gender. And I was criticizing public officials for what they have done and said. It's very different than hate speech, and certainly wasn't dehumanizing. I wasn't saying that the governor or Trump were subhuman in any way or second-class citizens or anything like that, nor would I, because I do believe we're all equal. So that's kind of a long answer. So when the right has said, hey, we haven't been able to say what we want, well, the kinds of things you wanted to say that you were punished for was really like dehumanizing. And for that reason, I think that it wasn't it was okay to chill that kind of speech. Now, I don't think that conservative ideas, right-wing ideas, theories should be, even if people find them offensive, those certainly should not be punished at all. But when you're talking about just purely racial invective, misogynist language, I think that can easily be punished, and I don't see a problem with that.
I just was in a moment of listening to you, overcome with gratitude for you for having this conversation with me, because the free speech and free inquiry have always been things that are very important to me, even before I knew how to describe them in those terms. A lot of that for me in the prior decade took on a religious dimension or an atheistic dimension, materialism, or just things like that, of just having the right to think and say things for myself. And so I want to, again, thank you for being on here to talk to me about this. I mean, it's an important issue and it is ironic. And I read your article and I was like, I know that his critics or enemies will have not read this, basically, and are going to hold it up against you. But I thought I asked you about it because, you're mentioning as a law professor, you can't not take a value position on anything. Like, it's just impossible, because that's what lawyers do. Lawyers make arguments and then judges render opinions based on those arguments. Those are the things we call them, arguments and opinions. And it's kind of hard to make an argument or have an opinion without making some sort of value claim, whether that could be debatable or not. And I thought yours was pretty narrowly defined. I mean, because there is an end result that could obtain from dehumanizing speech, which could result in actual genocide. And we brought this up at the beginning. You talked about just being Jewish and just having the trauma of the Holocaust living, as kind of this ever-present reality. I was not really aware of how much that was at the forefront of Jewish people's minds until a few years ago. I made someone who's now a very close friend, who's an Orthodox Jew. I went to Israel with him a couple years ago, about 6 months before the war. And it was interesting to just meet with him and hear about that. We visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, which was powerful. But, at the same time I was there was the largest protest in the history of Israel. It was 250,000 people in the streets protesting the Netanyahu government because they were trying to abolish judicial oversight, basically judicial review, and to just have the Knesset, rule everything by fiat. And there was this massive upswell of democratic protests there. And I don't know, I'm not exactly sure what question this is all leading to. It's just that these things are kind of on the forefront of my mind, of that there is a real consequence to proactively demonizing or dehumanizing discrete groups, because often they're scapegoated. They're being used as scapegoats as a way of, like, okay, a massive expansion of, for example, criminal power, or what's the word I'm looking for? Police power. What we're seeing now with ICE is, my question is, knowing the way authoritarianism goes, which is in one direction. Okay, well, let's say we've rounded up all of the immigrants and they're gone. Are we gonna, is ICE gonna disarm? History would suggest no, that's just not the way it's gonna work. We're just gonna find the next scapegoat. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, scapegoating is the primary tactic of dictator. Look at what's going on with the military attacking boats, small boats off Venezuela. They're saying, well, they're drug terror, or what are they, narco terrorists. And no evidence has been established that they are. Even if they were established as drug smugglers, that's not how you deal with them. But the idea is, well, they're dangerous people, and once you're labeled dangerous, you can do whatever you want to them. I mean, totally contradictory to the laws of war, and we could get into all that. But scapegoating, once you can convince enough of the public that these people are dangerous, that enables the dictator or the party in power to gives them power. It's empowering. And scapegoating is the age-old tactic. I mean, well before Hitler. Hitler just did it on a much greater scale than previous dictators.
Mhm.
But the whole idea of scapegoating is to generalize, make a false. It's really another term for this is blood libel. It's to
Mhm.
say those people. It's to paint with a very broad brush based on a very limited number of those people, a racial group, every national group of national origin. They all have people who are not nice, right?
Mhm.
To extrapolate from them to the entire group is totally misleading. And yet, even in 2025, millions of people fall for this,
Mhm.
and dictators know it, and they exploit it, and it's terrible. Now, the good news is that we're on to this. I mean, we see right through it. I think most people see right through what's going on with Venezuela and with ICE. I mean, and
Mhm.
more and more Americans are protesting this. We see right through it. But, in Nazi Germany, most people or many people did not see through it.
Right.
So we've made progress in that sense, but it goes on. It just goes on.
So in that article that you wrote, I mean, it really began with a mention of the now infamous hearings after October 7th attacks with Claudine Gay and I think was it Liz McGill, and there was a third president there, the three college presidents that led to Claudine Gay losing her job. She was the president of Harvard. That was in response to this horrible attack on October 7th by Hamas. For me, on October 8th, when I saw college students all across America shrieking with joy, basically, in favor of Hamas or against Israel and claiming that Israel was uniquely responsible, it was a time when for me, brought home that there was a problem in higher education, which was, you mentioned about like conservatives being punished. I don't think that's really the biggest issue that's been happening. I think what it's been is selectivity in hiring, that they're just not getting hired. Conservatives are just not getting hired. So there is a lack of viewpoint diversity in academia. And a lot of that viewpoint diversity has been most glaringly lacking on any sort of discussion about the state of Israel. And lots of discussion has been had about this. That one of the most bizarre things to me is that because it's, I think, a lot to do with identity politics, and it's viewed that like white people are seen as more powerful than people who are non-white. And so they're powerful, they're oppressors, the other people are oppressed. And then somehow the state of Israel has been conflated with white people, I guess because it's a very wealthy and powerful nation. The irony, of course, is that people of European descent are a minority in Israel. The majority of Jews there are Sephardic or African descent. But they're in that, we've kind of grafted the American racial problem between whites and African Americans, kind of grafted it onto that conflict. What was it like for you to see that? I mean, taking place then, and then to see these free speech issues come up? Because I know that, probably a lot of discussion of Israel might not happen in a lot of law school classrooms unless it's an international law or human rights course. But, how does that inform your viewpoint on this? Because it's not just as a law professor, but as a Jewish American.
Yeah, I kind of have mixed feelings. When I wrote that article, this was before my suspension, so I had no idea
Right,
that I
right.
would be living my article soon. I, free speech is something I tremendously value, but when I wrote that article, like many articles I write, it was more of an abstraction. So I totally see. I will not get into even saying I won't even venture into the argument, the debate, whatever you want to call it about Israel is itself going to inflame people because there's such passion, justified passion about what's going on in Israel and with the Palestinians and so on. It's not, and it's not my expertise. I mean,
Right.
I think a lot of people think after hearing the tapes of me in class that I'll just talk about anything. I'm
Right.
very, very careful about what I talk about. Now, I was talking about political figures, public officials, and I think that is legitimate, and it still is legitimate, and people should not be afraid to criticize public officials. But there is a chilling effect from my case. So I'm not really going to weigh in on. I
Sure.
do think that one thing that just should be emphasized is that if people are offended by speech, but it's not dehumanizing, you have to let them say it. Now, when I say you have to let them say it, I'm talking about universities. So there's offensive speech and there's dehumanizing speech. And that's the big distinction I drew, and this is my position. And that's why I wrote the article. But a lot of offensive speech is not dehumanizing, right? So some may find profanity offensive, but even just saying like, I think X is right, I think X is wrong, whether it's Israel, this or that, Hamas, might offend many people. But the First Amendment is there to say you're allowed to engage in offensive speech. The Supreme Court has said several times, the First Amendment isn't just protecting nice speech. It's much broader than that. It's protecting a lot of offensive speech that even might hurt people. No, they haven't made the offensive dehumanizing distinction that I'm making. So a lot of that they think can be dehumanizing too. I'd like to eventually see that go up to the Supreme Court and they draw that line. But that's my line right now. So offensive speech is still protected. And so I don't think any students or professors or administrators should ever be punished for saying what they think about Israel, Palestine, whatever. And to the extent that's happened, that's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, you made a great point about free speech, which is that if the First Amendment only protected popular opinions, we wouldn't need a First Amendment. I mean, it is, a lot of the people that if First Amendment lawyers will take, on as clients, a lot of times I'm sure they may vehemently disagree with. There's a wonderful documentary called Shouting Fire. It came out about the time you started at LSU. And it is the attorney Martin Garbus is a First Amendment attorney. His daughter Liz was the filmmaker. She interviewed him about the case of Tinker versus Des Moines. And no, wait, not Tinker versus Des Moines. It was the Skokie case in Skokie, Illinois. And in Skokie, which was, I think, a very large Jewish community outside of Chicago, Nazis applied for a permit to get to march. And it was interesting in that interview, Martin Garbus talked about, he's a First Amendment attorney. The ACLU, a lot of them didn't want to represent the Nazis in that case. There were a lot of Jews that were ACLU lawyers, and he also himself as a Jew decided to represent them. And that's has to be a tough case because obviously he would have found them as, personally abhorrent in their views, and yet he fought for their permit. And from what I understand, they did receive the permit, and it was a rather pathetic affair. In Nashville, we have a Nazi problem. There are like 12 idiots that will show up and hope someone will punch them because then they get all this publicity, and Nashville is seen as, Babylon of the South or whatever it is that we have here. But, it's mostly a bunch of bachelorettes riding around, on bicycles and drinking beer at the same time. But that's kind of what they want. And so there is an argument to say, like, this comes up a lot with Holocaust denial, which is a crime, I think, in most of Europe, that I've heard a lot of people here say, well, look, if there are Holocaust deniers among us, I want to know who they are. I want to have them make themselves known. And I can see that, but I think there's an argument for, I've always found there's the difficult problem of what do you do about the free speech rights of people that are advocating for the abolition of free speech? Like, that's a particular difficult problem. And here in the United States, this is an issue with the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. They use democratic means to gain electoral majorities to then vote out democracy. Like, that's a particular issue that we just in the United States don't have now. And there is, I think, this luxury belief that, well, yeah, if there's someone Holocaust denial, they're cranks, they're a minority, it's a fringe, and so it won't actually lead to anything, or so the assumption goes, that we should allow that to happen. And now I think because of the internet, because there are no bottlenecks on speech, that things can become algorithmically boosted. I'm not so sure that those harms are quite as remote as they used to be. Your thoughts?
Yeah, social media has possibly changed some of the assumptions, or as at least challenged some of the assumptions that we used to make about free speech. Because free speech is very much about whatever the consequences of your speech, it should be allowed. Again, putting aside the defamation and the fighting words and a few others. But social media says, well, the consequences of some of this speech that was traditionally or currently tolerated could be quite dire, right? Now there is a category of speech, incitement, and that is, and so when I was doing research, I'm trying to remember right now, but there is that category that you're not allowed to go in front of people and say, let's go get them, inciting violence. And in criminal law, that's like solicitation. It could be conspiracy, that kind of speech. And so that's clearly prohibited, but there's a distinction between, and they make this distinction, the Supreme Court, I think, has made this distinction between inciting violence and preaching violence. So you might have revolutionary theorist, and you think that you're a Marxist or Marxist-Leninist or whatever, and you think that we need a violent revolution. Even Thomas Jefferson thought we needed a violent revolution every 20 years. And so you might preach that either as a academic or as a citizen. And currently that is permissible because it's more theoretical, right? And I guess I'm still a traditionalist in that sense. I think we should allow, they talk about the marketplace of ideas, but you're right that the marketplace of ideas is dramatically skewed now by social media. And so you might get people that are preaching, not inciting violence, to be quite effective. And I mean, we already have people that, social media has led to people joining ISIS. I mean, it's led to a lot of violence.
Right.
Directly or indirectly. And I don't know, I just don't know that we change our framework to accommodate social media, but I don't have strong opinions either way. I mean, we are the United States is a violent country. Okay. We just are.
Yeah.
And, we just look at gun violence alone. I mean, and it always has been. And so I don't think you can make a consequentialist argument against. I would be wary of any consequentialist arguments against free speech, saying, well, you're adding even more violence. Well, how much more? And where do we draw the line? Well, when you reach this level of violence, then you got to suppress free speech. I just think that's a very dangerous road to travel.
There's a common, this term slippery slope. People use slippery slope without, I think, really understanding what it means, but it really comes a lot from First Amendment law, which is that, well, if you make it okay to censor this kind of speech, then it's going to become easier to censor the next kind, and something that seems way out of bounds now, that the goalposts will essentially change. And I am inclined to agree with you. I wouldn't say I'm a free speech absolutist. I don't think anybody really is. But I think with you, where I'm like, words are not violence. Violence is violence. It's interesting that on a lot of college campuses, people have actually said, no, words are violence. And that there's a lot of this has come about with, I think, recently has been around transgender people who are seen to be uniquely vulnerable to self-harm, we'll say. So one of the things I'm struggling with here is that this whole conversation is going to be read by an algorithm, and that's going to decide whether or not this video should be demonetized or conflict or whatever. So there's a particular word for self-harm that I'm avoiding using, which is unfortunate because it's an important issue. But, they're saying that if you will invalidate something like gender dysphoria or anything about the trans experience, that could very well lead to a lot of people self-harming. And so therefore, this speech in particular is a form of violence. And that has been used to, one of the things that I've been really concerned about on college campuses in particular is that it's really the students shouting down the people that are like guest speakers, for example. And Charlie Kirk was one of these people. He would go into very hostile territory and say very unpopular things. He had a microphone. I think he was a professional and he knew that, he was going to be able to speak. But one of the people I want to talk to on my channel, hopefully if I could get him as soon as possible, is Kyle Duncan. Do you know who he is? Yeah, he's a federal judge of the Fifth Circuit. He went to speak. He was appointed by Trump, and he went to speak at Stanford Law School. And students basically didn't allow him to speak. They shouted him down. I met him when I was at LSU in Paul Byers' advanced appellate advocacy class. He was representing Hobby Lobby in their case to not have to give birth control to their employees at the Supreme Court. That's someone who, I don't think there's a policy idea that I could be more opposed to than the idea that people should get a religious exemption to their employees having birth control. I mean, but he should still have his ability to speak. And I think he was a represented conservative Christian organizations. The students of Stanford Law School essentially prevented him from speaking. And I just wanted to know if you have, thoughts on that phenomenon, even in law schools, of this shouting down phenomenon and how it affects the cause of academic freedom.
Yeah. And that's an interesting part of the whole free speech debate, because it's really not, there's the legalities, we're talking about the Constitution, the First Amendment and all that. This is outside the kind of the scope of the law, where you have social forces leading to suppression of speech. To go back to before I answer your question, to go back to, what we're really talking about is hate speech. When we talk about should hate speech be limited on social media and legally limited? Because right now the real counterforce to hate speech is more speech. And that's generally what the Supreme Court has said, is that the best antidote is not regulation. The best antidote to offensive speech is not regulation, it's counter speech. But when people are self-harming or being hurt or killed as a result of speech, and words can hurt. Now, not necessarily inherently, although there is defamation. Defamation can, those are words, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me is not true often, sometimes. So there is defamation. But your point was more, the mere words are not causing the physical injuries or worse, but they can lead people to believe things or to act on hateful words. And there's a danger there. There are definitely dangerous words being disseminated on social media.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is what to do with that legally. Should we do anything or not? And it's a tough call. So that's hate speech. Now you're talking about when people shout down, usually right-wing visitors to a university, they're saying, well, that person is a purveyor of hate speech. And so we're gonna prevent that speech from being disseminated. Generally, I think that's wrong. Let them speak. And really, it's up to the university to to regulate. I mean, in some way, so to make it possible for visitors to speak. But it's a tough call. I'm not saying students are wrong, because sometimes they have a point. I don't think Kyle Duncan should have been shouted down at all. I mean, he would have been giving, a right-wing point of view, and that should be
Right.
perfectly
Straight from the Federalist Society playbook. I mean, he's a
that
he's a
should
U.S. Appeals Court judge.
totally protected speech and should be allowed, even if people are offended. That's why we have this First Amendment. But there are visitors who engage in dehumanizing speech, and that's not only inherently, I think, hurtful, but it's also dangerous. And so it's a tough issue, but I think in general, err on the side of letting the speech fly and marketplace of ideas, and you can let counter, now I will say that the other point of view, which is quite, I don't have a strong view on this, is that by allowing dehumanizing speech to just, be expressed, you are putting people's lives in danger. And you said before, it ultimately can lead to genocide. But you don't even have to get to genocide. You can have individual people harmed or groups of people harmed. And so I see both points of view. It's something that, I need to write a paper to work it out.
Yeah.
But, because I do believe in free speech and the marketplace of ideas, but I also believe that people should not, that hate speech, especially with social media, can be quite dangerous. So if there's a way to kind of balance those, I'm all for it, but it's not easy.
It's hard. Yeah. It's a tough call for anybody to make. And sometimes it's just really is unclear. And again, if it's not a government, the First Amendment protects us from state action, from the state or federal government action, governmental action. But, if it's a mob, they call it the heckler's veto is what it's called in the law. But also if it's just an algorithm on social media, I mean, they're privately owned platforms. It's not the federal government that are doing whatever. And so we do have, in theory, a choice to just, we'll go to another platform. If it's YouTube, I don't really think that's a legitimate thing. I think YouTube is a monopoly at this point. But you mentioned in your paper on free speech, and it's kind of the last question I think about this, and I want to pivot to free will if we can. The Chicago principles. Could you tell us about what those are and kind of what the significance of them is in this debate?
You didn't say there was going to be a pop quiz.
No. Yeah. Well, it's the you get there's a big block of text. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, you might know the answer, so why don't you?
I'll say the Chicago principle. It's from the University of Chicago. It's put out essentially a statement, 3-paragraph statement about their views on academic freedom and free discourse on campus. And it's interesting that it would come from University of Chicago. I generally know it as a conservative economics school, but of course it's a wonderfully good school, University of Chicago. But they have these Chicago principles. Stanford Law School affirmed those after the Kyle Duncan incident, and I think there were some changes at an institutional level there. But these are the kind of things that I think the Foundation for the Individual Rights of Expression, FIRE, would endorse. And I've actually been meaning to ask, have you had any communication with them about your case and what
FIRE's
assistance have they
awesome.
had? Yeah.
FIRE reached out to me early on, and they've been with me all the way. And really good people there. They're fighting on a lot of fronts, unfortunately today. I mean, they have always been, but it's been, I think, even more intense than usual. Fire is great. I strongly encourage everybody to contribute to Fire. They are almost single-handedly, as an organization, fighting for free speech, and they've been doing so for many years. I did not get any real support from almost any other group. AAUP has been virtually silent. ACLU, never heard from them. Most groups, but Fires was right there, and they've been there all along the way. They're just a great organization.
What kind of assistance have they offered? I mean, because I assume they don't have the resources to pay for everyone's defense or
Although
to mount it
my
themselves.
understanding is that they didn't, but they did say if I bring a damages claim, they would be interested because it was injunctive relief. I think they have a policy about, I think they only fund damages claims. I could be
Okay.
wrong, but and also I had a GoFundMe, and so I didn't want to
Yeah.
kind of burden them when they had all these other fights to, battles to fight. But they've also offered. They wrote a letter to the former president of LSU, Bill Tate, and they publicized letters often. But they'll provide lawyers. I don't know exactly how that's done. I think they reach out to various lawyers, and I didn't need that kind of help from them, but I may in the future. Just having an organization, just say we understand the problem. They wrote that letter. We're with you is enormous. I mean, just really anybody saying that to me has been enormously helpful. But to have a whole organization, a famous organization, do that meant so much to me. I mean, so I have nothing but praise for Fire. And people have said, well, they just I don't know that they have a political inclination. I really don't. I mean that they lean left or right. I don't care. They seem to care only about free speech, primarily about free speech. And that's they seem to be totally neutral, whether it's coming from the left or the right. And that's the way it should be. It shouldn't matter whether it's left wing or right wing speech. It should all be protected.
I don't know that there is a left. I mean, I guess it depends on who's criticizing them, that they're left or right? Like, and I'm not sure there is a left or right wing position on free speech. I can't make that make sense. And, I studied political science in undergrad, and like the idea of the left and right, it's a weird metaphor from the French Revolution that doesn't make much sense anymore. And, there is this issue that the further away you get from the moderate position, which we would call the center, the more they seem to resemble each other. And what I've been seeing in the United States and also in the West is, I consider myself a liberal, which is the Bill of Rights, like those first 10 things, the idea of freedom itself and the freedom to think, speak, and to live. That's what I see as what it means to be an American. And I've been seeing the political left and political right in this country becoming increasingly illiberal. But I've also said, this is the first time I'll say it publicly, that the problem isn't the same because right-wing extremists will form militias. Left-wing extremists will form committees. It's a different phenomenon. Left-wing extremism tends to be very process-oriented, and right-wing extremism seems to be more violent and more masculine. But that's why we have laws. Like, that's why we have a constitution and laws to protect us from these kinds of intrusions. And it seems like what we see now is that the left will have its excesses, and then the right will kind of overreact to what it perceives as the excesses. And that's what you get. Donald Trump is an example of that. And then we might have a left-wing overreaction. I hope not. I hope we can have more of a de-escalation, but we'll see. But I don't think that there is a left or right position on free speech. And I agree with you on Fire. There's no way to pin those guys down on, like, if you look at who they're defending, it's just the only thing that changes is who's being silenced in this current cultural and political zeitgeist. And right now that does seem to be people that are critical of the right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So I would imagine, I haven't monitored over time, I sort of have seen them defending this person or that person. But yeah, I think prior to even 2025, 2024, they were probably more defending people who had got in trouble for saying right wing kind of things. And you're right. I mean, right wing, left wing. I mean, but what does that even mean? Things that, let's put it non-egalitarian or inegalitarian things. And
That's
usually
that's an interesting dimension to consider left and right with. Yeah. I mean, different.
Yeah,
You're looking at
I
essentially.
tend to think of the left as egalitarian and the right as inegalitarian, and I'm sure many on the right would criticize me for that. But then I would like to know how they distinguish, but I think at the core, that's what differentiates the two sides. But you know, this is all political theory, and I'm not a
Right,
political
right,
theorist.
right, right. So, do you think we could talk about free will now?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
We have
this is
the freedom to do that.
do we have, but do we? That is the question, right? Like, I mean, or is this conversation been determined by the forces that acted upon us? I mean, I'll preface this by saying I, kind of had a very large change in my life. Actually, after law school, it changed a lot of things about me when I started criminal law in particular, changed a lot about my political beliefs because I saw the massive erosion in civil liberties that resulted from the war on drugs, because it just Fourth Amendment makes it really hard to lock people in jail for having a forbidden plant. And that's just not how things were supposed to go. So I started really rethinking a lot of things, and religion was one of them. And one of the things I found really strange was I was raised in the Catholic Church, and free will is just closely tied into the idea of the existence of God, which even as a young child, I found curious, because it's like, yeah, you have free will because God says you're supposed to. And he has a plan, and you have to follow the plan. You can't deviate from God's plan, but you have free will. I always found it to be an opposite position. It made no sense. And then started listening to more, like the Four Horsemen of Atheism were big then. Sam Harris got very big, and that uh, they believe there is no free will. And it's so strange to me. You would think it would be the opposite, that the atheists would believe in free will and that the Christians and Jews and Muslims would not. Just kind of give us an understanding of like, what are the different views on free will that are dominant today, and like where do these things break down in the discussion of crime and punishment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's obviously this debate about there's various debates about free will that have been going on for a long time. I think the 20th century really it accelerated, and so you got a kind of a fountain of different views. But the two basic camps are compatibilists and incompatibilists. Compatibilists think that free will. I should just distinguish. There's free will and there's responsibility. We talk about free will and responsibility. Some think that responsibility doesn't require free will. Some people think that we have free will without responsibility. So I'm just going to kind of use them interchangeably. If we can get into a distinction between them later.
Mhm.
But compatibilism is the idea that free will and responsibility are compatible with determinism, the idea that since the Big Bang, everything's been, there's been one unique trajectory that the universe could take based on the initial conditions of the universe and the laws of nature. It's been uniquely determined that everything, and that includes obviously us, we're part of the universe. So every action, every word we utter has all been kind of in the cards since the Big Bang.
Mhm.
Idea is we really couldn't have done otherwise. We think, right now it's snowing outside in Cleveland. I could just turn this interview off and go outside. But the fact that I'm not shows that I couldn't. I was determined all along to do exactly what I'm doing now by the initial conditions of the universe and the laws of nature. Incompatibilists think that they're incompatible. That if we are determined, if that's true, if that deterministic picture of the universe is true, then we can't be free. And then that group splits into metaphysical libertarians and hard incompatibilists, the skeptics. Metaphysical libertarians, which I'm one, and we're in a minority among free will academics, think that we are genuinely free and genuinely responsible, at least for some of our behavior, meaning we're not determined to act as we do. And the hard incompatibilists have a very clever argument that whether we're determined or not determined, we can't be free either way. If we're not determined, then everything's just random. And, if neurons are randomly firing, that doesn't make us free. And if we're determined, then we already saw the argument would be, well, if you're uniquely determined since the Big Bang to do what you do, then you couldn't have done otherwise, and then you can't be free. So there's basically those three camps, compatible, and then there's different kinds of compatibilists. Metaphysical libertarians, actually, there's a few camps there, and then hard incompatibilists are more, they're a growing kind of movement. You had mentioned them before, Sam Harris and others, that there's more and more of them saying, yeah, we just don't have free will and responsibility. And then their task is to kind of say, well, then what do we do? What do we do differently? And some say kind of keep things more or less as is, and they provide consequentialist justifications for that.
Mhm.
Some say, no, we got to radically change the criminal justice system and all sorts of blaming and punishing kind of institutions to conform with this new realization or new understanding that we don't have free will or responsibility. And so there's debates among them. I'm a metaphysical libertarian, but I'm also a criminal justice reformer. So I believe that we can be genuinely free and genuinely responsible, but I'm not like, hey, everything's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems like there's this compatibilism seems to be kind of like a middle position where it's like we don't have absolute free will, but we also don't have absolutely no free will either. There's like, to me, it seems obvious that there's some gradations of free will. I guess it's are free will and choice synonymous in this context? Because that kind of, it's hard
Yeah,
to know what we're even talking
yeah, that's
about.
a good, yeah, we haven't really defined it. And of course, when people ask me, do you think we have free will? I have to ask, well, what do you mean? And generally it's, at any given juncture, you have at least two options. I could do X or I could do not X. It would be one way to construe the options. I could do X or I could do Y or I could do Z. I mean, and it seems like most of the time, I mean, unless we're held at gunpoint or we're chained to the wall, there's many options available to us. Now, we tend to not live like that, just doing one thing one day and another thing another day. We have routines, we have patterns, we have jobs. But it does seem that at any given moment, I could do otherwise. While I'm talking to you, I could not talk to you.
Hmm.
Choices, but the metaphysical libertarian isn't going to say that every choice is free. Some choices we make are quite constrained. And so for example, like I need a job to make money and I need money to eat. So I really don't have a lot of free choice there when it comes to doing my job, right? Or if there's a gun to my head, I still have a choice. I could comply
Right.
or not comply, but it's a very constrained choice. And so, and most people would say that's not a free choice. So yeah, it is choice. I think that's probably
Yeah.
the
Well,
best word
so
for it.
that also informs like criminal capacity, diminished capacity, things like that. I mean, there's one of the things you also learn when you go to law school is there's just a massive difference between how the law is depicted in media and culture. Television shows. I don't know how many television shows there's an insanity defense or a movie. The movie Primal Fear is an example of that, and it's a vanishingly rare phenomenon that this is even a relevant matter, in criminal proceedings. And there's a specific thing about whether the person even has a capacity to know what they're doing. But it does kind of make sense that if someone there's this case of a shooter at the University of Texas, I think in the 50s or the 60s. Do you know this? Yeah, and the guy, when they did the autopsy on him, he had massive tumors all throughout his brain. There's also lots of neuropsychology to this. There's the famous case of Phineas Gage, which is where neuropsychology comes from. He was this British guy and had a railroad spike up his nose, and it hit him right here in the orbitofrontal cortex. And he was like this church mouse. And then this happened. And then all of a sudden he was fighting, gambling, in and out of jail. And it just was apparently a result of this prefrontal lobe injury. And so I think you could say that those two men probably had a little bit less free will because a lot of choice is inhibition. It's in not doing the thing. And if the part of your brain that inhibits that, those impulses is damaged, you do have a real issue there. How does that, but when you look at these things, that obviously there's a medical context. I've seen you've made the argument in places as well that societal forces also constrain our choices. Could you elaborate on how that informs your views on criminal justice reform?
Yeah, just before I answer that, this is how the free will problems intersect with the mind body problem, or some would call it the problem of consciousness. But clearly, we have a brain, and the brain is the control center, and what we do, what we say, what we see, is all happening in the brain. Right. And so one of the more simple arguments for determinism is the brain is a physical object. Physical objects are governed by the laws of nature, laws of physics, ultimately. And so everything is just the initial conditions of the brain and everything that the brain does. And therefore, everything your body does, the words you utter, the motions of your body are all kind of dictated by the brain. And the brain's activity is dictated by its initial conditions and the laws of nature. So at any given time, right now, my brain is in a certain situation, all the atoms, and those atoms are all being governed by the laws of nature, the laws of physics. And so every step along the way is uniquely determined by the initial conditions and the laws of nature. And that's an argument for determinism. Indeterminists will say, there's still some play. There's some wiggle room, even with the laws of nature. The laws of nature are not, it's not like Newtonian laws that are absolutely 100% governing. There's more constraining, but not fully dictating or governing. Where society comes in is, think of behavior not in terms of brains and neurons and atoms, but think about our behavior in terms of upbringing. This could all be translated neurologically. We don't have the neural language yet or the neurological understanding, but we know that when, for example, our parents teach us from a very early age not to hit others, that goes into our brain and it gets processed, and usually there's punishment when we do, and that gets processed, and eventually our brains tell us refrain from hitting others, right? And so the brains are still the medium, but between the environment and our actions. And social forces have tremendous influence on us. The reason you and I can communicate is we both learned English. We have our different sets of overlapping values. Most of those values came from society, from parents, from authorities, from today, social media. I mean, some of us are always evolving. We were talking before about free speech and some of the more tougher issues. I can evolve on those issues. I want to hear the arguments. I want to think more about it. Sometimes I've decided this is where I am. I publish a paper and say that. But all of this is I'm influenced constantly. There's so much input from the environment, other people, the environment itself, and that all comes into the brain, and the brain does what it will with it based on who you are and what your brain configuration was at that time. The only question is the output. Do I have multiple possible outputs with all this input coming in? And a lot of the input is from myself, right? I'm in my head a lot. I'm processing things, so there's a constant kind of input. You think of the brain like a computer. There's just lots of stuff coming into the brain. What comes out is that the question is, do I have multiple possible outputs, or is there only one possible output? Intuitively, we have multiple possible outputs. We could do this, we could do that, we could do this. But the determinists think, no, there's really only one. It's an illusion that you could have done otherwise.
I do want to ask about the distinction between free will and responsibility, because I assume, if the average person's response, if you tell them that there's no such thing as free will, I think the majority response is going to be something like, well, then why do we bother even putting people in jail? I mean, I think that's just a layperson's gut reaction is, well, then why do we have jails? Why do we punish people? Is that a failure to kind of distinguish between free will and responsibility that's taking place there?
It's a failure to distinguish between determinism and fatalism. Determinism, so most compatibilists are determinists, or they at least say, even if determinism is true, we're still free and responsible. And then when somebody says, well, then it doesn't matter what we do, they say, no, it does matter. And they're very consequentialist generally about punishment. They say fatalism is the idea that no matter what you do, there's going to be this inevitable result. So if somebody says, no matter how many jobs you apply for, you're not going to get them, then you just say, fine, I'm just not going to apply, right? Assuming they know what they're talking about, yeah, right? And that's not determinism. Determinism says you don't know what path the universe is going to take, but whatever path it does take, it was determined from the outset to take it. So keep applying, and let's hope that the determinist path in the cards all along was to get that job. But you have to be in that causal chain. You have to keep that causal chain going to that. Without you doing that, first of all, you're determined to submit the applications you do. So you don't really have the option of dropping out, the fatalist kind of thing. But if you did drop out, you were convinced by the fatal, then you were determined to drop out, right? So the idea is you still need that causal chain. Determinism doesn't say there aren't causal chains and that results aren't sensitive or dependent on those causal chains. Fatalism kind of does. Like the Oedipus is the classic example of fatalism. Like he was told from a early age that he was going to marry his mother or something. And so he went out of his way not to marry his mother, and then thereby ended up marrying his mother.
Right. Fatalism. It was
fatalism was the idea. No matter what you do, you're going to end up marrying your mother. That's not determinism. It's a little confusing though, because determinism suggests that whatever happens was inevitable. And that's fatalism too, but there's two kinds of inevitability there. So it is a failure to distinguish between just fatalism and determinism, and it's not always easy to do that.
I was just thinking when you're talking about determinism, it's like, well, look, I mean, it may be determined if you're going to get the job or not, but you just got to keep going. You got to keep trying, and you have to essentially act as if something good will happen, as if you have free will, even if you don't. But I was just thinking there, that sounds an awful lot like faith. I mean, that's basically what a faith position is. You just have to have faith that if it's meant to work out, it will work out, which is a very kind of que sera, 12-step kind of ethos of like, that's essentially what you're talking about is fate versus faith. They're also assuming you choose to some of this comes down to another thing I'm fascinated by, which is the existential dilemma and just kind of the different ways to deal with this apparent lack of objective meaning in the universe. And I've been fascinated by the absurdist position as brilliantly. I don't know if you've seen the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, but there's you haven't seen it. It was the Oscar film. You should watch it. It's brilliant. There's a character that represents the nihilist position, and there's a character that represents an existentialist position, and there's an absurdist element to it. But it's like, whether this means something or it doesn't, whether you have free will or you don't, you should choose to act in a way that's most conducive to living a good life. And whether you want to get a job or not, like if you want the job, you need to take the actions that are the necessary prerequisites to getting that job. And so it still does. It's such a conundrum to think about because it's like, well, it sure seems like we have free will. It sure feels that way. And maybe we'd like to think that way, but how does this inform, the way that crime and punishment operates?
Yeah, well, and let me just say that you were connecting fate and faith and just keep going, and it's all meant to work out. These are all things that I've been thinking about for the last 10 and a half months, because when you're going through a crisis, the term I prefer is dark nights of the soul, based on Thomas More's book. You hope that it's going to work out, and you hope that there's some sort of meaning, that this isn't just a random, cruel accident of the universe, that that there's some meaning in this. And so I can see now, all my life I've kind of been curious about faith. I just have never had it, and I wanted it, but I just could never access it. But you also learn, I've been learning a lot about meditation and Buddhism and so on. But I think the most meaningful, all the things I've read, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is still just such a wonderful book. He says when he was in, concentration camp, and he would see various prisoners at some point just give up, and they would smoke a cigarette, and then he knew they were going to be killed, and they had resigned themselves to being killed. And he said they were asking themselves the wrong question. They were asking, what more can I expect from life? And their answer was nothing. This is hopeless. He said, that's not the right question. The right question is, what can life expect from me? And when he put it that way, it's very empowering. I have to live up to something in my struggle. And millions of people have struggled, billions have struggled, are struggling now with something or other. And you have to, this is part of life. It's going to present challenges and problems. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying, I don't condemn anybody who's succumbing, because these problems can be overwhelming. But these things help me thinking about free will and thinking about fate and faith, and these things. There's some comfort in the idea that we are fated to succeed, even if it's not true. To answer your question about crime and punishment, the criminal justice system is basically predicated, the American criminal justice system, but I think most criminal justice systems are predicated on the idea that when you pronounce somebody guilty and you convict them of a crime, and then you punish them, the idea is they are responsible. They freely committed the crime and are therefore responsible for it. And that's just a basic. They had options. They had the option of committing the crime or not committing the crime. They freely chose to commit it, and now we're holding them responsible. And so everything's kind of fair. You could give a compatibilist view of that. You could give a metaphysical libertarian view of that. You can't give a skeptical. The skeptics will say that free will and responsibility those are illusory, and therefore this is an unfair system. They're unfair. What we're doing with convicted criminals is unfair because they are not genuinely free or responsible. Nobody is. But these are the kind of the metaphysical assumptions on which the whole criminal justice system is based. And then you have to, and then the challenge for the skeptics, and they have responded to it, is what do you do with people who are found guilty? I mean, especially the more violent ones, the ones who have stolen a lot, people you can't trust to be among us in society. What do you do with them? And there, again, I think I mentioned this before. One of the big answers now is quarantining them. And the idea is treat them as if they have a disease, not as if they're responsible. This didn't work out really with COVID, but there was a kind of a self-quarantining that went on. There were some mandates, schools said if you contract COVID, you can't come back to school for another 10 days after you recover. There were sort of these mandates, but in any event, the idea is to treat criminals like that and not as free and responsible people because nobody is. And then once they're no longer contagious or dangerous, let them out. It's very much like how we treat people who are acquitted on the basis of insanity. We lock them up generally still. We commit them until they're no longer a danger to themselves or others. And the idea is to extend that to all criminals. It's an interesting proposal. It's consistent with their skepticism. You might wonder, well, what's the difference between what we're doing now and what we're doing there? Not a lot, but there's different language we're using. We're not using the language of blame and punishment and free will, just as we don't with people who are contagious, with
Right.
a deadly disease. And so they think, generally, they think it will be more humane. The prisons or the institutions will be more humane because we're not blaming and punishing. One can wonder about that. There have been counter arguments that no, we'll actually be crueler. Look at what we did as recently as the 90s and 60s in mental institutions.
Mm-hmm.
They treated them as guinea pigs for experiments. Now, so the arguments go every which way, but those are the basic positions.
So I kind of want to go back just on basically on what you just said, but also to what you said a little bit before you went to talk about crime and punishment and this dark night of the soul moment, because I can relate a lot to that. And it involved something that happened to me when I was in law school. And that ultimately was the reason I wasn't able to ever graduate was I had this health problem come up, this mysterious thing, which I've now learned is an autoimmune disorder, but it was misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder, severe mental illness, which created a number of problems because at that time, the Louisiana Supreme Court would summarily deny admission to anybody who had been diagnosed with that disorder. But also that I maintained immediately that was just a misdiagnosis. And in our society, in Western medicine's why I'm very interested in a lot of these issues, including medicine. If you tell someone you think you've been misdiagnosed with a severe mental illness, that tends to confirm the diagnosis in the average person's mind, because we have this belief that people who are severely mentally ill lack insight into the nature of their condition. And the evidentiary basis for that is unfortunately not very strong. But for a long time, I was on all these psychiatric drugs and they were very hard to come off with. And there was it was a dark, to say a dark night of the soul. I mean, I lost 10 years of my life to the effects of the drugs. And it was hard because I felt very much that I'd been the victim of an injustice and I couldn't get, in medicine, it's particularly hard, particularly psychiatric medicine, because they can just simply discard your ability to be reasonable. So if someone, it's always been my worst nightmare, because if someone a priori disavows your ability to be rational, what reasons could you give them to change their mind? It's actually a terrifying dilemma. And it just kind of touched on that a little bit when you mentioned about putting people in insane asylums in the 50s and 60s. And there's a reason there's a whole subgenre of horror films that are set in asylums, because it's a terrifying position. It's also a really effective way to discredit people if you were so inclined. And I found that you mentioned studying Buddhism and spirituality in this time, and that I can just say that from my perspective, that was the only thing that ever gave me any comfort. Buddhism in particular, Zen, meditation, and that has actually grown. I think I had to tear down my spirituality and my cosmology because of the question, like, how could bad things happen to good people? And there being no one calling the shots is a really satisfying explanation to that, actually, that there is no one, there's no good God out there. And over time, I've kind of rebuilt a spirituality that feels perhaps more secular, and involves the study of the mind. And there was one event that I had I want to share with you, and I know we're close to wrapping up, but it involves free will. Plant medicine, psychedelic medicine has been an important part of my recovery, without which I wouldn't be here talking to you. I probably wouldn't be anywhere. And I had an event that happened some years ago when I was deep under with psychedelic medicine, and I saw all the people that ever hurt me in a really serious way. Not everybody, not the guy that cut me off in traffic, but the people that really hurt me. And then I started to see the people that hurt them, and then the people that hurt them. And there was this chain of causation, and really in a cosmic sense, that what I call infinite regress. I have a meditation that I do now called the meditation of infinite regress, where I reverse the chain of causation back to the Big Bang. And during the process of having that experience in the moment, I realized instantaneously that forgiveness became a foregone conclusion for me. And it almost wasn't even like I forgave people so much as that I realized there was almost no need to, because it's like, I see that you've got one of your dogs on your couch behind you. If you come home and he's gotten into the trash and he's messed up your apartment, you may get angry and you may punish him, but you probably don't feel the need to forgive him, because it's just such a petty idea, to forgive a dog who's doing what a dog does. And people are kind of that way. If you realize the cycle of abuse and the way it perpetuates, it was such an instant thing. I was not at that time, I was not connecting anything about free will and forgiveness. Forgiveness was so hard for me, but just the recognition that, like, man, I mean, I think some of the people that hurt me the most thought they were doing the best. And it was just such an interesting phenomenon that resulted for me. So I just wanted to share that. I was just felt compelled, and to say that studying these things, asking these questions, meditating on them has definitely helped me through my dark night of the soul, which I hope was much longer for me than it will be for you or anyone else. But that's what's kind of a lot of what's motivated me to start this channel, is also there are so many different things that I have to say about the world and getting ground down by the American healthcare system and insurance and all that, that these are the kind of things that I'm motivated now, is to tell people that there is light on the other side of that dark night of the soul. And I hope that you can find it. And we have your GoFundMe that we're going to be putting in the description, also a link to Fire and some other things too. And I want to thank you for coming on and sharing all of this with me. It means a lot to me that you would honor me by being my guest here. This is my second video. And with that, I'd like to give you the last word. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to me or to the audience or to anyone else?
Well, first of all, thank you, and I'm honored to be your second guest. And I think this is going to be a very successful. I hope it's a very successful YouTube channel. And are you making a podcast out of this too?
Yes, yeah. It's gonna go out to multiple platforms, but YouTube's the primary.
Good, great. I wish you the best of success. Anything I can do to help. I did want to just say I'm very sorry. 10 years, I haven't made it through a year of this. And I don't know that I could do 10, no less 2 years of
Mhm.
this struggle. So I hand it to you. You are a strong, extremely strong person to have gotten through that. You're an inspiration. What I'm doing, I'm reading a lot about people who've made it through. And so I'm very glad you're doing this channel and the podcast. And maybe you can write a book about, just making it through. I mean, people have talked about their struggles with mental health, with cancer, um, you know, legal struggles. I'm a big fan of, I'm already forgetting his name. Um, Hold on one second. Let me just pull it up here. I've read several books by, his name is Michael Singer, I think. I think it's
Michael
Michael
Singer.
Singer.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Untethered
And
Soul. Yeah.
yes, it's Untethered Soul. Thomas More, Dark Nights of the Soul. These are extremely helpful books. When Everything Falls Apart,
Mm-hmm.
I'll get you the author's name.
Chinua
But in
Achebe.
any
Yeah.
event, I think that people who are struggling with anything, relationships, this, it's very soothing and helpful just to hear what other people have to say about getting through these things. These are things I'd never listened to before. I'd never really, I guess, had a struggle. I mean, yeah, I've had my stresses, but this has been a struggle. So, and one last thing about forgiveness, what they say about forgiveness is it's much more for you, the forgiver, than for the forgiven. It's not about saying they did something horrible to me or my family, they're forgiven as some sort of blessing or just gracious gesture to them. It's much more about going on with your life and without the, the anger and the hatred and the vindictiveness. But it's hard to do when somebody genuinely wrongs you and really hurts you. It's hard. But I think you're right that it's very, it generates empathy and understanding when you can see that that person is a mean SOB because of what happened to them. I will just say one last thing. There are psychopaths, though. I'm reading a book about Charles Manson. And Charles Manson was from a very early age, just he could not conform to the rules. It was probably neurological. So in that sense, it was done to him. But and so he was in and out of juvenile detention and then eventually as an adult prison, in and out, in and out. Just couldn't do it. Uh, so it's not always now. And by the way, when he was in juvenile detention, he was raped, and he also learned from other criminals, how, so there's a whole story there. But my point is, yes, when you have enough understanding of somebody's situation, wrongdoer situation, it can generate empathy and ultimately forgiveness. But I do think forgiveness is ultimately it's not for society to forgive criminals. It's for the victims to forgive criminals. That's on them. That's up to them. Society, we have other obligations. And so so when people say that a jury should just forgive somebody who's dangerous, and I'm not saying you're saying that, we have to be wary of that. So, yeah.
There's a saying in 12-step lore, which I've dabbled in, but it's not a part of my life now, but that resentment is like drinking poison and hoping the other person will get sick. And it kind of is, because usually the person you're resenting doesn't even know about the thing. Like, they don't care. They're on doing their life. They don't care generally, so it really does only hurt you. And I just wanted to say that, like, I hope that your legal case will come to a satisfying conclusion. I know that often is not the case in litigation or criminal law for that matter, but I hope that you get that. But whether it does or it doesn't, I hope that your path through this is not in any way dependent on that. Mine definitely wasn't, because the thing that was so devastating to me was I lost an identity when I couldn't finish law school. I built up an identity around being a smart person, being someone who's rational, being someone that had made all the right choices. And the way that when I finally knew that I was better than I was before, which was in the last year and a half, was I started to realize how grateful I was that it happened, because I was becoming very successful at becoming someone I was not meant to be. And then I began to see that finally as a blessing in disguise, that it enabled me to suffer so much that it basically was like, I will do anything to just be happy again. And that involved kind of a radical shift of what I was doing in my life, and led me to be here in Nashville and not Louisiana, and trying to have a career in media and entertainment, which I would never have even considered that before. And now all of that suffering does give me perspective that I can offer to people like you and to others, to say that it's like that job application from a determinist perspective. Even if you can't see where it's leading, you just going to have to continue to act as if it's going to lead somewhere good. And it's so often that it will come from the most random and unexpected of places, and then you look back and go, I never could have gotten here if it wasn't for the worst thing that ever happened to me. So
Yeah. Sorry. Before I forget, the two things that you just made me think of, gratitude, and I want to mention medications. Gratitude, they say, is also a great liberator, and it's probably the most direct road to happiness. So it's very easy, and I'm learning this from people who've been through much worse than I've been. It's very easy to get very angry and fearful. But when you can count your blessings, I mean, really, like, my dogs, my cat, like your friends, the supportive community, that can be quite conducive to happiness and overcoming. And then I'll just say medications. I mean, you didn't have the best luck with them, at least for a long time, it sounds like, and that's really unfortunate. But there are plenty, and most people are, we're quite well aware in 2025 in a way that we weren't probably even 20 years ago, of medications. You know, People should not think that, and I've talked to a bunch of people over the years that I don't want to change my personality. I'm going to go through this without medication. And I don't think that's very smart. Medications, we talked about the brain before, and it's got to have a certain level of serotonin. And if your serotonin levels are depleted, you're going to be depressed, you're going to be anxious. And there's no reason not to. We have the medical technology now, we have the medicine. If you're struggling with something, get the medications one way or another. Easier said than done if you don't have the right insurance, but generally I think most insurance policies cover it.
a lot of them
And there's
do. The one I was on one that was $1,600 a month, so they always found a way to not pay for it. And I just would get samples, which was bizarre.
That's
Yeah,
unfortunate.
I'm one of the people I'm going to interview very soon is a neuropsychiatrist, and who can really talk to about, like, there's no way to have an absolutist position on drugs, because that includes Tylenol and heroin. I mean, like, there's
And
just no way. Right. Or exactly. I mean, I've given up caffeine, has actually been one of the things that's helped me the most.
No, I don't take
Yeah.
my coffee away from me.
No, well, it's good if it's good for you. Well, that's the thing, is it's so individual. And my issue with the medications is not the drugs themselves; it's the manner in which they're being prescribed, how they get approved, where the research comes from, and in the systemic things. But after I have that conversation, I'll definitely send it to you when I do. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think asking for help, being open to help, receiving help, um, going through anything alone is just vastly inferior to anything else, even just having a pet. And for me, for a long time, I didn't have that. I didn't have anybody. I was very, very much alone. And then it became a self-imposed exile because I was so ashamed. I thought I deserved it, to be alone and to be miserable. And then it kind of became a badge of honor, which was not a good thing for me either. And I had a time when I started to, and I felt so bitter and angry for a long time. And I coined this phrase, which does happen every now and then, that I was like, I've got a choice. I could feel bitter or I could feel better. Like, it's just as simple as that. Like, I could feel right and feel aggrieved and probably be justified in my righteous anger. And I could be miserable the rest of my life feeding on that righteous anger. I mean, that's what Fox News is. It's just grievance porn, basically. And life's just better when you finally are able to let that go. But man, if you told me that 5 years ago, I would have been so angry at you for trying to make me let go of my anger. And that's just kind of what came from me being really, really isolated. Friendship and community, these things help. And I'm glad that we were able to just reconnect in this way. I would really love to have you back on, because there's never enough time for me. Like, I've just learned that there's 2 hours will never be enough, 3 hours. And definitely to hear more, updates with how things are going with the trial. Hopefully we can continue to help you get some support for your legal fees. And then also, like, talk about more about some of the issues that we talked about, that I wish that we had. This whole conversation was just to talk about your academic work and not why you're not able to do it right
I'd love to talk with you again anytime. This was a lot of fun. I don't get to talk about my work or myself much.
now.
So this was a blast. Thank you. Like I said, it's a great honor. Thank you.
Thank you too. Thank you very much, Professor Levy.